Welcome to Avoidant Decoded, where we explore the deeper psychology behind silence, distance, and emotional patterns most people never fully understand. If you're someone who wants clarity instead of confusion, this space is for you. Consider joining our membership to go even deeper into these insights and start seeing relationships from a whole new perspective. Most people think silence means nothing is going on, but in this case, your silence was never empty. It became the first time the avoidant side of them had to sit alone with their own thoughts, without distractions, without blaming someone else, without emotional noise, and without anyone chasing after them. In that quiet space, something uncomfortable started to rise. For the first time in a long time, they had to face parts of themselves they had been running from for years. While you have been focusing on healing, protecting your energy, rebuilding your confidence, and setting stronger boundaries, something has been shifting inside them as well. When you stopped chasing, you created a space they can't easily escape anymore. Without your presence constantly softening the consequences of their actions, they are now left alone with themselves in a way that feels unfamiliar. That distance begins to expose patterns they usually avoid. Without your reactions to shift the focus, without emotional arguments to hide behind, and without your consistent support always being there, they are finally forced to look at their own behavior. The emotional safety net they depended on is suddenly gone. They can't rely on your energy while avoiding responsibility at the same time anymore. This is often where quiet self-awareness begins. Whether they admit it or not, your silence disrupts the cycle they were comfortable in. The behaviors they used to ignore become harder to justify when no one is there to participate in the pattern. Your absence acts like a mirror, reflecting everything back to them. It makes them notice how they push people away while still craving connection deep down. It highlights how the same emotional outcomes keep repeating in different relationships. For some avoidant individuals, this becomes the starting point for change. For others, it simply creates discomfort they try to escape from as quickly as possible. Sometimes they move towards someone new, not because they've changed, but because the new person hasn't recognized their patterns yet. Still, your silence leaves a mark. Even if only for a moment, they were forced to face truths they usually avoid. The avoidant mindset survives by building emotional defenses over time. They create explanations, justifications, and narratives that protect them from fully confronting the pain they've caused. But those defenses only work when someone else continues playing their role in the cycle. As long as someone keeps chasing, reacting emotionally, or trying to fix everything, they can continue avoiding real self-reflection. Your silence removes that entire system. In the past, every time you chased them, they convinced themselves you were too needy. Every emotional reaction became proof in their mind that you were overly sensitive. Whenever you tried to hold the connection together, they shifted the blame onto you instead of looking inward. Now, those old labels don't fit anymore because you stopped playing that role. There's no drama left for them to point at, no emotional reactions to blame, no desperate pursuit to use as evidence. Because of that, their usual ways of escaping responsibility begin to fall apart. Your silence takes away their ability to twist the story. They can't say you ruined the connection when you walked away calmly and with dignity. They can't label you as unstable or demanding when you responded with peace instead of chaos. Their defenses weaken because there's nothing left to manipulate or reinterpret. What's left is a quiet emptiness where truth slowly starts to rise. In that silence, difficult questions begin to surface. If every relationship ends in a similar way, eventually they have to ask themselves why. If people who once cared deeply about them keep walking away quietly, they are forced to consider their own role in those endings. Your calm withdrawal makes this realization harder to avoid because there was no dramatic ending to distract from the real issue. This is what interrupts the cycle. Usually, when they pull away emotionally, it triggers the other person to chase. That chasing creates even more distance. Over time, the relationship turns chaotic, and that chaos gives them a reason to leave while avoiding responsibility. But your silence stopped that pattern before it could repeat again. Instead of chasing, you set boundaries. Instead of pleading, you accepted. Instead of conflict, you chose calm detachment. That unexpected response creates confusion within them because it doesn't match what they were prepared for. They expected another emotional reaction. They expected you to keep fighting for their attention. Instead, they were met with distance, peace, and self-respect. That forces them to think differently. They begin wondering why you didn't chase them this time. They question whether you emotionally detached long before they noticed. They think about whether they pushed things too far. And because your silence doesn't give them clear emotional answers, those thoughts stay in their mind much longer than any argument ever could. Your silence also removes a form of emotional validation they relied on more than they realized. Even if they seemed independent, your presence gave them reassurance in ways they didn't openly acknowledge. Your attention made them feel valued, desired, and important. When that steady source of attention disappears, a sense of emptiness starts to grow inside them. Suddenly, the emotional energy they once took for granted is gone. That absence begins to disturb the image they had built about themselves. Without your validation constantly there, deeper insecurities slowly start coming to the surface. The avoidant side of them is then faced with the loneliness that has always existed underneath their emotional distance. They slowly begin to realize that connection might matter to them far more than they ever admitted. They start noticing that they are not as unaffected as they once believed. The way people see them, the way they are experienced emotionally, begins to carry more weight than they expected. And most importantly, they start to feel something they tried to deny for a long time, that your absence actually impacts them on a deeper emotional level. Underneath the distance, the emotional walls, and the need to stay detached, there was always a natural human desire for connection. That part of them never truly disappeared. It was only buried. When that truth starts surfacing, it creates a strong inner conflict. It challenges the identity they built around being independent, self-contained, and emotionally unaffected. For a long time, they convinced themselves they didn't really need anyone, that they were fine on their own. That closeness didn't hold real importance. But your silence begins to break that belief apart. The moment they realize you genuinely mattered, they are pushed to face emotions they usually suppress or minimize. That experience is uncomfortable because it opens emotional doors they work hard to keep shut. It brings them into contact with vulnerability, attachment, uncertainty, and emotional reliance, things they usually try to control or avoid completely. At the same time, your silence places them in a space of uncertainty about where they stand with you. Before, when you were still reaching out, still trying, still emotionally present, there was always an unspoken sense that they had access to you. Even if things felt distant, they believed they could return and find the connection still there in some form. That quiet sense of security supported them more than they realized. Now that safety is gone. Your silence removes it completely, leaving them unsure. They don't know if this is truly the end. They don't know if you would respond if they reached out. They can't tell if the connection is still there or if it has quietly closed for good. For someone who depends on emotional control and predictability, this kind of uncertainty creates a pressure they don't know how to handle. For the first time, the dynamic is no longer familiar. The usual push and pull is gone. There is no emotional chasing, no predictable rhythm guiding the distance and closeness. They no longer know what comes next. The structure they relied on has disappeared, and that loss of control creates a discomfort that is hard for them to even explain. Your silence becomes more than just absence. It becomes a boundary, a quiet line that shifts the entire dynamic between you. Their usual defenses stop working because there is nothing left for them to manage or avoid in the same way. Now, you are the one deciding if the connection continues. You are the one holding the power of whether things ever move forward again. For someone whose emotional system is built around controlling distance and avoiding vulnerability, this shift feels deeply unsettling beneath the surface, even if they never say it out loud. This discomfort often grows when they begin paying more attention to you than they ever did before. When you were always there, showing care, being open, and staying consistent, they never had to question your feelings. Your presence already reassured them without effort. It became something they relied on quietly, even while taking it for granted. But silence changes that completely. The reassurance disappears, and in its place comes uncertainty. They may start checking your social media more often, wondering who you are spending time with, thinking about what your life looks like now, questioning whether someone new has entered your world. They might even ask others about you, trying to gather small pieces of information without directly reaching out. This behavior feels unfamiliar to them. They are not used to being the one wondering, searching, or watching from a distance. Yet they continue because your absence activates emotions they are not comfortable handling. The emotional roles begin to reverse. Now they are the one trying to understand something they no longer have full access to. They are the ones sitting with unanswered questions. And that shift matters because it places them in emotional territory they have spent most of their life avoiding. Your silence also removes the constant emotional noise that once distracted them from themselves. When the dynamic was active, their focus stayed on managing the relationship, controlling distance, reacting, and maintaining balance. Their attention stayed outward, locked onto the connection rather than their own inner world. As long as things were moving, they never had to slow down enough to really look within. There was always something happening, another interaction, another reaction, another cycle. The relationship itself became a distraction from deeper self-awareness. But once you step out completely, everything changes. When you stop chasing, stop forcing connection, and stop responding within that old rhythm, a deep silence takes its place. And inside that silence, there is nowhere left to hide. There is no pursuit to resist, no closeness to manage, no messages to ignore, no emotional chaos pulling their focus outward. there is only stillness, and stillness affects people very differently than conflict. Conflict keeps attention busy. Silence turns attention inward. It removes distractions and closes off escape routes. It forces them into a level of stillness they are not used to sitting in. And within that stillness, buried emotions begin to rise. They may start recognizing patterns they ignored before. They may remember past relationships they never truly processed. They may begin feeling emotions they buried under distance and avoidance for years. Without distractions to cover those feelings, they are left alone with themselves in a way that feels unfamiliar and heavy. The weight becomes even stronger when they start to sense that your silence might not be temporary, when they feel that you may not return to the old pattern, when they realize you may no longer accept the same dynamic, when the thought crosses their mind that this time you might actually be done. At that point, everything shifts. It's no longer just about distance. It becomes the possibility of permanent loss, and that realization carries a weight they can no longer easily ignore. What once felt like temporary distance now starts to feel like something much more final. The silence no longer feels like a pause, it begins to feel like a real ending. And that shift creates a kind of pressure they were never emotionally prepared to handle, because this is no longer something they can fully control. In the past, endings didn't feel permanent to them. Even after pulling away or becoming inconsistent, there was always a belief that they could come back and find the connection still there. There was a quiet comfort in thinking that access to you would always exist in some form. But now that certainty starts to disappear. The emotional door they once assumed would stay open no longer feels guaranteed. And as they watch you continue your life, growing, finding peace, and moving forward without waiting for them, the impact becomes deeper. The loss stops feeling like a possibility and starts feeling real. This is no longer distance they created and managed. It's separation that exists outside of their control, and that difference matters. Their patterns have always relied on controlling closeness and distance, but your silence changes that completely. If they stay with these feelings long enough, instead of escaping into distractions or emotional shutdown, it can lead to a deeper internal breakdown, one that forces them to finally face the emotional wounds and patterns they have avoided for years. Your absence reveals things your presence once covered. The dynamic of you chasing and them withdrawing created a system where they didn't have to fully confront themselves. When you reached for them emotionally, they justified their distance by telling themselves they just needed space, that things were getting too intense, or that independence mattered more. Your reactions gave them something external to focus on, instead of looking inward at their own fears around closeness and vulnerability. They became focused on managing your emotions instead of understanding their own. And because you stayed, because your care remained steady even when things were difficult, they slowly began to expect your presence without realizing it. There was an unspoken belief that you would always be there, no matter how inconsistent they became. But your silence removes that completely. Suddenly, the excuses stop working. The stories they told themselves begin to fall apart. Without you there to shift responsibility onto, they are left with a much harder truth. That maybe the issue was never your emotions, your effort, or your need for connection. Maybe the deeper issue was their fear of vulnerability. This realization becomes even harder to avoid when they think back on what they once believed about the relationship. There were likely moments where they convinced themselves that if you just gave them space, if you stopped chasing, everything would naturally improve. But now that has happened. You stepped back fully. You stopped chasing. You stopped trying to carry the connection on your own. And yet, something inside them hasn't changed. The discomfort is still there. The distance still shows up. They still feel the urge to pull away when things become emotionally real. They still struggle with consistency. They still feel uneasy when vulnerability appears, even without pressure from you. If they are honest with themselves, this reveals something they have avoided for a long time. Their patterns didn't start with you, and they don't end with your absence. This behavior existed long before this relationship and continues beyond it, which means the root of the issue was never external, it was always internal. It comes from emotional conditioning and unresolved wounds they haven't fully faced. You were never the cause of those patterns. You were simply the reflection of them. Your silence also makes them recognize something they overlooked while you were there, the value you quietly brought into their life. When someone consistently offers care, patience, understanding, and emotional warmth, it can slowly become normalized, not because it lacks value, but because it's always present. Your support became part of their everyday life. It was constant, which made it easier for them to underestimate how meaningful it actually was. But once it's gone, everything shifts. They begin to notice the quiet where your presence used to be. They feel the absence of stability, the missing comfort, the lack of understanding, and the loss of that feeling of being emotionally seen without having to explain everything. And this is when they begin to realize that what you gave them wasn't ordinary. Other people may come into their life, But something feels different. The depth isn't the same. The connection doesn't feel as natural. The emotional safety they had with you becomes harder to replace than they expected. That realization makes your absence feel even heavier because now they are faced with the possibility that they lost something rare without recognizing its value when they had it. At the same time, another awareness begins to form. They may start noticing that this pattern hasn't only happened with you, it has repeated itself across different relationships. Before, it was easy to blame timing, circumstances, or the other person. They didn't have to fully look at their own role in why things kept ending the same way. But now the pattern becomes clearer. Different people, different situations, but the same emotional sequence. Things begin well, closeness grows, vulnerability increases, fear shows up, distance follows, and eventually the connection breaks. And through all of those different experiences, one thing stays the same: them. This is one of the hardest realizations to face, because it means they are often the one pulling away when things become real. They are the one struggling with vulnerability. They are the one creating distance when connection deepens. Without someone else to project responsibility onto, that truth becomes harder to avoid. The illusion begins to break. The belief that their behavior is normal. The idea that emotional avoidance doesn't cause damage. The assumption that relationships are meant to function through distance and inconsistency. For the first time, they begin to see that the pattern itself may be the very thing blocking the closeness they always wanted. In the end, your silence was never about punishment or trying to make them feel something. It became the moment everything finally slowed down enough for truth to come forward. While you were focusing on healing, rebuilding your peace, and choosing yourself instead of repeating unhealthy patterns, they were left facing the emotional reality they had been avoiding. For the first time, they couldn't hide behind blame, distance, or control. Your absence forced them to confront what was underneath it all: the fear of vulnerability, the fear of real closeness, and the cycle that kept pushing love away even when they wanted it. And whether they change or not, your silence has already shifted everything, because now they understand something they didn't see before. Your presence mattered, your love had depth, your consistency wasn't something ordinary. The way you walked away calmly carried more impact than any argument ever could. Sometimes silence speaks louder than anything else because it removes every distraction and leaves only truth. And the truth they are now left with is simple. You were never the problem they believed you were. You were the reflection of everything they had been avoiding within themselves all along. Your silence was never about losing them. It was about finally choosing yourself. What felt like absence became a mirror they could no longer ignore, and a boundary they could no longer control. Whether they grow from it or run from it is their journey. But your growth is no longer tied to their awareness, because real power is not in being chosen, it is in walking away when you are no longer valued. And sometimes, the quietest decisions create the loudest transformations.